My name is Susan Parker. I'm 34 years old, and 6 weeks ago, my father used my sister's promotion dinner to mock me in front of his business colleague, holding up my business card like it was a punchline he'd been saving all year. My father, James Parker, spent 23 years building a law firm he named after our family. Not just any firm, Parker and Associates, a boutique corporate law practice operating out of a glass-fronted office in the financial district. The kind of address that comes with a brass nameplate and a receptionist who answers the phone like she's guarding a secret. He wore pocket squares to casual dinners. He referenced his bar exam score in arguments that had nothing to do with law. And he made absolutely certain that every room he walked into understood he was the patriarch of a family that had built something that mattered. What he never mentioned, what he never even considered, was that the firm's most important client wasn't there because of his golf club contacts or his LinkedIn endorsements. I knew. I knew the exact percentage of their annual revenue that one account represented. I knew how quietly the firm had been bleeding smaller clients for the past 2 years. I knew because Meridian Financial Group, the Fortune 500 company I'd been consulting for, the one responsible for nearly 30% of Parker and Associates' yearly billing, stayed on their roster because of a referral I made 18 months ago. My father just didn't know it was my referral that had been keeping the lights on. And if you want to know exactly how a daughter watches her own father take credit for her work for 18 months and says nothing, stay with me. This story gets so much worse before it gets better. There is a photograph on my parents' refrigerator that has been there for 11 years. Emily, 22 years old, holding her law degree in both hands, grinning in her graduation gown, while my mother cries happy tears into my father's shoulder. My father is looking directly at the camera, like a man who has just won something. Behind them, the campus of Georgetown University stretches out in that particular golden afternoon light that makes everything look like it was always meant to happen exactly this way. I am not in the photograph. I was there that day. I drove 4 hours to be there, but I am not in the photograph. I have never said anything about that. It's a small thing, except that it isn't, and we all know it isn't. And the fact that the photograph is still there after 11 years, unchanged, while the rest of the kitchen has been repainted twice, tells you most of what you need to know about the Parker family and where I have always stood inside it. My name is Susan Parker. I am the older daughter, the one who did not go to law school, the one who did not follow my father into the firm, the one who sat across from my parents at 24 years old and told them I was starting a consulting business, and watched my mother look at my father and my father look at his dinner plate. No one said congratulations. My mother asked if I had a backup plan. My father asked if I understood how competitive the market was. Emily, who was studying for the bar at the time, said nothing at all, which was somehow the loudest response in the room. I signed my business registration papers alone at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October. I made myself a cup of coffee, I read the documents 3 times, and then I signed my name and sat there for a while in the quiet of my apartment and thought about what I was building and why. There was no photographer, there was no one crying happy tears. There was just me and a ballpoint pen and a decision that I knew, even then, was going to cost me something inside that family before it gave me anything back. Parker Advisory Group started as 1 client, then 3, then a roster that grew steadily over 7 years because I was good at what I did and I worked in a way that made people trust me with problems they hadn't told anyone else about yet. By the time I was 33, I had a team of 9, an office with my name on the door, and a client list that included 4 Fortune 500 companies. My father's firm had my name on the letterhead too, technically, Parker and Associates. He just never made the connection. Or maybe he never tried. Sunday dinners at my parents' house followed a structure so consistent you could set a clock to it. My father would arrive at the table last, because my father always arrived at the table last, and he would sit down and unfold his napkin and begin talking about the firm before anyone had touched their food. A case he was managing, a client he had landed, a younger attorney at the office who showed promise or didn't. My mother would listen with the focused attention she reserved exclusively for him, asking follow-up questions in the right places, her food going slightly cold on her plate while she gave him her full face. Then he would turn to Emily. How is the brief coming along? Had she heard back on the motion? What did her supervising partner think of the revision? Emily would answer with the careful confidence of someone who had learned early that this table was also an audition. And my father would nod slowly, the way he did when something met his standard. And my mother would smile at Emily the way she smiled at the Georgetown photograph, like she was watching something she had always known would happen. Then dinner would continue. That was it. That was the full rotation. James, then Emily, then whatever my mother had read in the news that week, then dessert. I sat at that table for years, and I can count on one hand the number of times either of my parents asked me a direct question about my work. Not a dismissive question, not a challenging one, just a plain, ordinary, interested question of the kind you ask someone whose life you are curious about. For a long time, I told myself it wasn't intentional, that they were simply more comfortable with a world they understood, that law was their language and consulting wasn't, that the gap was about fluency rather than feeling. I told myself a lot of things at that table while I passed the bread and smiled at the right moments and drove home afterward with that specific hollowness that only comes from being invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to know you best. Then I stopped telling myself those things and I started writing them down instead. Not out of bitterness. At least, that's not how it started. It started practically, the way most of my decisions do. I kept a running note in my phone. Dates, occasions, what was asked, what wasn't. A record, clean and factual, of the pattern I had been trying for years to convince myself didn't exist. My father's firm mentioned 14 times at one Thanksgiving dinner. My quarterly revenue, which had just crossed 7 figures for the first time, mentioned 0 times, because no one asked. The data was unambiguous. It always is, when you finally make yourself look at it directly. I looked at it. I kept looking. And I kept adding to the ledger, one dinner at a time. 18 months ago, I was sitting in a quarterly strategy meeting with the senior leadership team at Meridian Financial Group when their CFO, a sharp and straightforward woman named Carol Danes, mentioned almost in passing that they were looking to consolidate their legal representation. Their current firm was billing inconsistently and had recently lost 2 of the partners Meridian had built their relationship around. Carol wasn't asking me directly. It was the kind of comment that gets made at the edge of a conversation, half observation, half opening. I noted it and said I would think about whether I had anyone worth recommending. I drove home that evening and sat with it for longer than I should have needed to. Parker & Associates was not the most obvious choice. There were larger firms with more dedicated corporate divisions, firms with cleaner infrastructure and newer technology, and partners who returned calls the same day. I knew their weaknesses because I had been paying quiet attention to my father's complaints for years, the way you learn the floor plan of a house you grew up in without ever meaning to. I knew they had capacity. I knew they needed stable revenue. And I knew, though I had no logical reason to factor this in, that a referral of this size would matter to my father in a way that very few things still could. I told myself I was making a sound professional recommendation. Meridian needed a firm that would treat them as a priority, rather than one account among hundreds, and Parker & Associates was exactly the kind of mid-size practice that would do that. It was a reasonable fit. I wrote up a brief summary for Carol, listed the firm's relevant experience, vouched for their corporate work personally, and left it at that. I did not tell my father. I want to be precise about why, because it would be easy to frame this as strategy, as if I was already setting something in motion with a specific outcome in mind. That isn't what it was. The truth is simpler and sadder than that. I didn't tell him because I wanted to see if he would find out on his own. I wanted to see if, somewhere in the process of onboarding a major new client, someone at the firm would connect the name Parker Advisory Group to his daughter Susan, and he would call me, just call me, and say something like, "Was this you? Did you do this for us?" He never called. Meridian signed a retainer with Parker & Associates worth just under $1 million annually. My father announced it at the next family dinner as a testament to the firm's growing reputation in the financial sector. He was visibly proud. My mother squeezed his hand across the table. Emily asked which partner would be leading the account. I passed the bread and said nothing, and added one more entry to the ledger. Emily made junior associate on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my mother had already planned the dinner, already called the good restaurant, Artie suggested in a group text that we all dress up a little because this was a proper occasion and the family should mark it properly. I read the message on my way into the office and typed back that I would be there, and then I put my phone down and looked out my office window for a moment at nothing in particular. I want to be honest about what I felt because it would be convenient to say I felt nothing, that I had insulated myself so thoroughly by then that the familiar sting of it simply didn't reach me anymore. But that isn't entirely true. I felt the small, involuntary deflation of someone who already knows how a room will be arranged before they walk into it. And then I felt something else, something quieter and more deliberate, because that same week I had received a box of my newly redesigned business cards, and they were, genuinely, the most tangible thing I had ever held that represented what I had built. Managing Director, Parker Advisory Group. Embossed gold lettering on heavyweight cream stock, the kind of card that has a weight to it when you set it on a table, the kind that doesn't bend. I had approved the design 3 weeks earlier, and when the box arrived, I opened it alone in my office and held one card for a long moment before I placed it carefully back with the others. I brought the box to dinner. I am aware of how that sounds in retrospect. I am aware that bringing your business cards to your sister's promotion dinner could read as competitive, or tone-deaf, or desperate for equivalence. But that is not what it was, or at least it is not all of what it was. It was an olive branch. It was me deciding, one more time, to show up with something genuine and hope that the room might, just once, make space for it. My mother had arranged the table the way she always arranged things around Emily's achievements, completely and without remainder. There was a card from a judge my father knew. There was a small bouquet in Emily's favorite color. There were printed photographs from Emily's first day at the firm, arranged near the centerpiece like a small curated exhibition of a life being lived correctly. My father was already mid-story when I arrived, something about Emily's supervising partner and what he had said about her instincts, and my mother was listening with her whole body the way she always did, and Emily was smiling, the careful smile of someone absorbing praise they have decided they deserve. I set my bag down. I hugged my mother. I sat in the chair that had always been mine at that table. In my bag, the business cards sat in their box, still closed, still waiting for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. My father had invited a colleague to join us for the latter part of the evening, a man named Douglas Hale, who was a senior partner at a competing firm and who my father had known for close to 20 years. Douglas arrived after the main course, ordered a drink, and settled into the table with the easy comfort of a man who is used to being welcomed into rooms. He and my father fell immediately into the rhythm of two people who speak the same professional language and enjoy the sound of it, and the conversation expanded to include Emily, who held her own with the practiced fluency of someone who had been training for exactly this kind of dinner her entire adult life. Business cards came out the way they sometimes do at the end of evenings like that, naturally and without ceremony, the adult version of a formality. Douglas slid one across to my father, one to Emily. Emily presented hers with both hands and a quiet confidence that I genuinely respected even then. I reached into my bag and placed mine on the table. My father picked it up. He didn't reach for it immediately. He finished his point to Douglas first, and then he picked it up the way you pick up something someone has left on a table, casually, with no particular expectation. He turned it over once. He looked at the front. And then something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not contempt exactly, something closer to amusement, the private kind that doesn't bother to hide itself because it doesn't consider the other person's feelings to be a relevant factor. He said the gold embossing was a bit much for a consulting hobby. He said it the way he said most things, pleasantly, conversationally, with a smile that contained no awareness of its own cruelty. He set the card back down on the table and looked at Douglas, and they shared a brief moment of the kind that men like them share, small and collegial and completely at my expense. My mother said nothing. She moved her dessert spoon a quarter inch to the left and looked at the centerpiece and said absolutely nothing. Emily said that at least it was a nice card. She said it lightly, almost kindly, in the tone of someone offering a consolation prize they know you didn't ask for. It was the kind of comment that is technically neutral and functionally devastating, and she knew exactly what it was when she said it. I looked at my mother. I looked at Emily. I looked at my father, who had already moved on, already back in conversation with Douglas, the card still sitting on the table between us like something discarded. I picked up my card. I put it back in my bag. I folded my napkin into a neat rectangle and placed it beside my plate. Then I stood up, said goodnight to the table, and left. I did not cry in the car. I want to say that plainly because I think there is an expectation that a moment like that one should produce tears, should crack something open, should send a person driving home through blurred vision with the radio off and the weight of it pressing down on their chest. And maybe for a different person it would have. But I have been sitting at that table my entire adult life, and I think somewhere along the way I used up whatever part of me was still capable of being surprised by it. What I felt instead was something much quieter and much more final. The specific stillness of a decision that has already made itself before your conscious mind has caught up to it. I drove for about 12 minutes before I pulled over. Not because I was upset, not because I needed a moment to collect myself. I pulled over because I wanted to write the email properly, and I don't write important emails while I'm moving. That is the kind of person I am. I have always been the kind of person who, even in the middle of something that matters, wants the execution to be correct. I sat in the dark on a quiet street 3 miles from my parents' house, and I opened a new email to Carol Danes. Carol and I had worked together for 4 years by that point. She was the kind of professional I had modeled parts of my own approach on, direct without being cold, decisive without being careless, the sort of person who respected your time by getting to the point and expected you to do the same. She had trusted my recommendation when I steered Meridian toward Parker and Associates. She had trusted my judgment more times than I could count across 4 years of strategy work together. I owed her honesty in return. I wrote that I had a conflict of interest I needed to disclose, one I should have raised at the outset and was raising now. I told her that Parker and Associates had a family connection I had not adequately considered when making the original referral, and that in the interest of her company's best representation, I believed a transition to independent counsel was the professionally responsible course of action. I told her I had 2 firms in mind that I trusted completely and would be happy to make introductions at her convenience. I read it back twice. I adjusted one sentence. I read it once more. Then I pressed send, pulled back onto the road, and drove the remaining 3 miles to my apartment in the same quiet I had carried with me out of that restaurant. I made tea when I got home. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had signed my business registration papers 7 years earlier. I looked at the walls of the apartment I had paid for myself, and the life I had built from a decision no one at that dinner had ever asked me about. I slept without difficulty. Monday morning, I was at my desk by 7:30, which is not unusual for me. I had a full calendar, a strategy session with a new client at 9, and an internal check-in with 2 of my senior consultants at 11. I made my coffee, reviewed my notes from the weekend, and settled into the kind of focused morning that reminds me regularly why I built this life and not some other one. The call from Meridian's procurement coordinator came at 8:43. She was professional and brief in the way that people are when they are executing a decision that has already been made above them. She confirmed that Meridian Financial Group would be initiating a transition away from Parker and Associates, effective at the end of the current billing cycle, and that Carol Danes had asked her to relay personal thanks for my transparency and professionalism in flagging the conflict. She asked if I was available later in the week to discuss the 2 referrals I had mentioned in my email. I told her Thursday worked, and we confirmed a time, and that was the entirety of the call. I finished my coffee and walked in to my 9 o'clock. My phone was on silent during the session, face down on the table beside my notebook, the way it always is when I am with a client, because I believe that the person in the room deserves the version of you that isn't half somewhere else. The session ran until 10:50. When I turned my phone over afterward, there were 4 notifications waiting. A missed call from a number I didn't recognize that turned out, when I looked it up later, to be the main reception line at Parker and Associates. A text from my mother that said simply, "Susan, can you call me when you get a chance? It's nothing urgent, just wanted to chat," with a period at the end that made it feel considerably more urgent than she was pretending. 2 missed calls from Emily, one at 9:17 and one at 9:44. No voicemail left for either, which told me more than a voicemail would have. I put my phone back down and walked into my 11 o'clock. I have thought about this since, about whether there was something cold in it, something deliberately punishing about letting those calls sit unanswered while I went about my morning. But the honest answer is that I was not punishing anyone. I was working. I was doing what I do every Monday morning in the office I built and the life I chose. And the fact that their timeline and my timeline did not align was not something I was willing to apologize for. They had spent years not asking about my work. They could wait one morning while I did it. By the time my 11 o'clock wrapped up and I sat back down at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee, there was a 5th notification. My father. 1 call, no voicemail. I set the phone face down again and opened my afternoon notes. He came on Wednesday. I knew he would come in person eventually because my father is a man who believes that physical presence is a form of authority, that showing up somewhere commands a gravity that phone calls cannot. He has built his entire professional identity around walking into rooms and filling them, and I understood, even before my assistant called back to tell me that a James Parker was in the lobby asking to see me, that this visit was less about reconciliation and more about the instinct of a man who has never had to wait for a door to open. I let him wait for 11 minutes. Not as a tactic. I was finishing a document that needed to be finished. When I walked into the lobby, he was standing near the far wall where we display our client partnership frames, the ones that show the logos and engagement dates of every major account Parker Advisory Group has held over the past 7 years. I watched him reading them for a moment before he noticed me. I watched him doing the math. The names on that wall represent a combined annual revenue that would make his firm's best year look modest, and I could see in the set of his shoulders that he was understanding something about his daughter that he had never previously allowed himself to consider. I took him to the small meeting room rather than my office. I offered him water. He declined. He asked me to reverse the recommendation to Meridian. He said it as directly as that, not as a question, initially, more as a statement of what he expected the outcome of the meeting to be. And then he caught something in my expression and recalibrated into something that was almost a request. He talked about the firm. He talked about the staff, the junior associates, the support team, the people who would be affected by a revenue loss of this size. He talked about legacy and about what the Parker name meant and had always meant. He did not, at any point in the first several minutes of talking, mention me specifically, except as the person with the ability to fix what he was describing. I let him finish. Then I told him, as calmly and as precisely as I could, that I had made a professional recommendation to a client based on a conflict of interest I should have disclosed earlier. I told him that was a standard professional responsibility, the same kind he had exercised hundreds of times in his own career on behalf of his own clients. I told him I had full confidence that a firm with his experience and reputation had the capacity to rebuild the revenue over time. I told him I genuinely hoped they would. And I meant it, completely, without irony or qualification. I have never wanted my father to fail. I have only ever wanted him to see me. He left without saying much. At the door, he stopped and looked back at the wall of frames and then at me, and something moved across his face that I did not have a name for yet. I went back to my desk and finished the afternoon. The invitation came from my mother, which was deliberate. My father would have known that a direct request from him carried too much weight in the wrong direction, so he sent Shannon, the way he has always sent Shannon into rooms he doesn't know how to enter himself. Her text was warm and careful, and slightly longer than her texts usually are, which told me she had written it more than once before sending it. She said she was making my favorite, the braised chicken with the lemon and the herbs that she has made since I was 9 years old, and that it would mean a lot to have the whole family together. She did not mention Meridian. She did not mention the firm. She said it would mean a lot to have the whole family together, and I read that sentence twice, and then I said I would be there. I want to be honest about why I went. It was not because I expected anything to be resolved. It was not because I believed that a Sunday dinner and my favorite meal constituted the kind of reckoning that 7 years of ledger entries pointed toward. I went because they are my family, and I have never stopped loving them, not even at the worst dinners, not even in the car afterward with that specific hollowness sitting in my chest. Love and clarity are not the same thing, and I have learned to hold both at once. The table was quiet in a way it had never quite been before. My father had prepared something, I could tell from the way he sat, the way he had his hands folded in front of him, with the careful posture of a man who has rehearsed. He spoke after we had eaten, after my mother had cleared the first plates, and what he said was closer to an apology than anything he had offered in the lobby of my office. He said the business card comment was out of line. He said he hadn't fully understood the scope of what I had built. He said he was proud of me, and the words came out slightly stiff, the way words do when they are true but unpracticed. Emily said she was sorry too, briefly and quietly, looking at the table when she said it. My mother reached across and put her hand over mine. I sat with all of it for a moment. Then I told them that I appreciated what they were offering, and that I meant that sincerely. But I also told them, as gently and as clearly as I knew how, that I didn't need an apology for the business card. The business card was one evening. What I had needed an apology for was every dinner before it, every question that was never asked, every quarterly milestone that passed without a single person at this table thinking to wonder how I was doing. Until they understood the difference between those two things, I would keep showing up, because they were my family, and I was not going anywhere. But I would keep both relationships, the family one and the professional one, at exactly the distance they had chosen first. Nobody said anything for a moment. My mother squeezed my hand and didn't let go. My father nodded once, slowly, like a man beginning to understand something he should have learned years ago. Emily refilled my glass without being asked. It was not everything, but it was a beginning, on my terms, at last.